Chapter 11 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Montague accepted his friend's invitation to share her pew at St. Cecilia's, and next Sunday morning he and Alice went, and found Mrs. Winnie and her cousin. Poor Charlie had evidently been scrubbed and shined, both physically and morally, and got ready to appeal for one more chance. While he shook hands with Alice, he was gazing at her with dumb and pleading eyes. He seemed to be profoundly grateful that she did not refuse to enter the pew with him. A most interesting place was St. Cecilia's. Church-going was another of the customs of men and women which society had taken up, like the opera, and made into a state function. Here was a magnificent temple, with carved marble and rare woods, and jewels gleaming decorously in a dim religious light. At the door of this edifice would halt the carriages of society, and its wives and daughters would alight, rustling with new silk petticoats and starched and perfumed linen, each one a picture, exquisitely gowned and bonneted and gloved, and carrying a demure little prayer book. Behind them followed the patient men, all in new frock coats and shiny silk hats. The men of society were always newly washed and shaved, newly groomed and gloved. But now they seemed to be more so. They were full of the atmosphere of Sunday. Alas for those unregenerate ones, the infidels and the heathen, who scoff in outer darkness, and know not the delicious feeling of Sunday, the joy of being washed and starched and perfumed, and made to be clean and comfortable and good. After all, the really dreadful wickedness of 6 days of fashionable life, and afterward the parade upon the avenue, with the congregation of several score additional churches, and such a show of stylish costumes that half the city came to see. Amid this exquisite assemblage at St. Cecilia's, the revolutionary doctrines of the Christian religion produced neither perplexity nor alarm. The chance investigator might have listened in dismay to solemn pronouncements of everlasting damnation, to statements about rich men and the eyes of needles, and the lilies of the field which did not spin. But the congregation of St. Cecilia's understood that these things were to be taken in a quixotic sense, sharing the view of the French marquis that the Almighty would think twice before damning a gentleman like him. One had heard these phrases ever since childhood, and one accepted them as a matter of course. After all, these doctrines had come from the lips of a divine being, whom it would be presumptuous in a mere mortal to attempt to imitate. Such points one could but leave to those whose business it was to interpret them, the doctors and dignitaries of the church, and when one met them one's heart was set at rest, for they were not iconoclasts and alarmists, but gentlemen of culture and tact. The bishop who presided in this metropolitan district was a stately personage who moved in the best society, and belonged to the most exclusive clubs. The pews in St. Cecilia's were rented, and they were always in great demand. It was one of the customs of those who hung upon the fringe of society to come every Sunday and bow and smile and hope against hope for some chance opening. The stranger who came was dependent upon hospitality, but there were soft-footed and tactful ushers who would find one a seat if one were a presentable person. The contingency of an unpresentable person seldom arose, for the proletariat did not swarm at the gates of St. Cecilia's. Out of its liberal income the church maintained a mission upon the east side, where young curates wrestled with the natural depravity of the lower classes, meantime cultivating a soul-stirring tone, and waiting until they should be promoted to a real church. Society was becoming deferential to its religious guides, and would have been quite shocked at the idea that it exerted any pressure upon them. but the young curates were painfully aware of the process of unnatural selection, whereby those whose manner and cut of coat were not pleasing were left a long time in the slums. On one occasion there had been an amusing blunder. A beautiful new church was built at Newport, and an eloquent young minister was installed, and all society attended the opening service, and sat and listened in consternation to an arraignment of its own follies and vices. The next Sunday, needless to say, society was not present, and within half a year the church was stranded and had to be dismantled and sold. They had elaborate music at St. Cecilia's, so beautiful that Alice felt uncomfortable and thought that it was perilously high. At this Mrs. Winnie laughed, offering to take her to an afternoon service around the corner, where they had a full orchestra and a harp and opera music and incense and genuflections and confessionals. There were people, it seemed, who liked to thrill themselves by dallying with the wickedness of Romanism, somewhat as a small boy tries to see how near he can walk to the edge of a cliff. The father at this church had a jeweled robe with a train so many yards long, and which had cost some incredible number of thousands of dollars, and every now and then he marched in stately procession through the aisles, so that all the spectators might have a good look at it. There was a fierce controversy about these things in the church, and libraries of pamphlets were written, and intrigues and social wars were fought over them. But Montague and Alice did not attend this service. They had promised themselves the very plebeian diversion of a ride in the subway, for so far they had not seen this feature of the city. People who lived in society saw Madison and Fifth Avenues, where their homes were, with the churches and hotels scattered along them, and the shopping district just below, and the theater district at one side and the park to the north. Unless one went automobiling, that was about all of the city one need ever see. When visitors asked about the aquarium and the stock exchange, and the Museum of Art and Tammany Hall and Ellis Island, where the immigrants came, the old New Yorkers would look perplexed and say, "Dear me, do you really want to see those things? Why, I have been here all my life and have never seen them." For the hordes of sightseers there had been provided a special contrivance, a huge automobile omnibus, which seated 30 or 40 people and went from the Battery to Harlem, with a young man shouting through a megaphone a description of the sights. The irreverent had nicknamed this the Yap Wagon, and declared that the company maintained a fake opium joint in Chinatown, and a fake dive in the Bowery, and hired tough-looking individuals to sit and be stared at by credulous excursionists from Oklahoma and Kalamazoo. Of course it would never have done for the people who had just been passed into society to climb upon a Yap Wagon, but they were permitted to get into the subway, and were whirled with a deafening clatter through a long tunnel of steel and stone. And then they got out and climbed a steep hill like any common mortals, and stood and gazed at Grant's tomb, a huge white marble edifice upon a point overlooking the Hudson. Architecturally it was not a beautiful structure, but one was consoled by reflecting that the hero himself would not have cared about that. It might have been described as a soap box with a cheese box on top of it. And these homely and familiar articles were perhaps not altogether out of keeping with the character of the humblest great man who ever lived. The view up the river was magnificent, quite the finest which the city had to offer, but it was ruined by a hideous gas tank, placed squarely in the middle of it. And this again was not inappropriate. It was typical of all the ways of the city. It was a city which had grown up by accident, with nobody to care about it or to help it. It was huge and ungainly, crude, uncomfortable, and grotesque. There was nowhere in it a beautiful sight upon which a man could rest his eyes without having them tortured by something ugly nearby. At the foot of the slope of the river drive ran a hideous freight railroad, and across the river the beautiful palisades were being blown to pieces to make paving stones, and meantime were covered with advertisements of land companies. And if there was a beautiful building, there was sure to be a tobacco advertisement beside it. If there was a beautiful avenue, there were trucks and overworked horses toiling in the harness. If there was a beautiful park, it was filled with wretched, outcast men. Nowhere was any order or system. Everything was struggling for itself, and jarring and clashing with everything else. And this broke the spell of power which the Titan city would otherwise have produced. It seemed like a monstrous heap of wasted energies, a mountain in perpetual labor, and producing an endless series of abortions. The men and women in it were wearing themselves out with toil, and there was a spell laid upon them, so that, struggle as they might, they accomplished nothing. Coming out of the church, Montague had met Judge Ellis, and the judge had said, "I shall soon have something to talk over with you." So Montague gave him his address, and a day or two later came an invitation to lunch with him at his club. The judge's club took up a Fifth Avenue block, and was stately and imposing. It had been formed in the stress of the Civil War days. Lean and hungry heroes had come home from battle and gone into business, and those who had succeeded had settled down here to rest. To see them now, dozing in huge leather-cushioned armchairs, you would have had a hard time to guess that they had ever been lean and hungry heroes. They were diplomats and statesmen, bishops and lawyers, great merchants and financiers, and men who had made the city's ruling class for a century. Everything here was decorous and grave, and the waiters stole about with noiseless feet. Montague talked with the judge about New York and what he had seen of it, and the people he had met, and about his father and the war, and about the recent election and the business outlook. And meantime they ordered luncheon, and when they had got to cigars, the judge coughed and said, "And now I have a matter of business to talk over with you." Montague settled himself to listen. "I have a friend," the judge explained, "a very good friend, who has asked me to find him a lawyer to undertake an important case. I talked the matter over with General Prentice, and he agreed with me that it would be a good idea to lay the matter before you." "I am very much obliged to you," said Montague. "The matter is a delicate one," continued the other. "It has to do with life insurance. Are you familiar with the insurance business?" "Not at all." "I had supposed not," said the judge. "There are some conditions which are not generally known about, but which, I may say, to put it mildly, are not altogether satisfactory. My friend is a large policy holder in several companies, and he is not satisfied with the management of them. The delicacy of the situation, so far as I am concerned, is that the company which he has the most fault to find is one in which I myself am a director. You understand?" "Perfectly," said Montague. "What company is it?" "The Fidelity," replied the other, and his companion thought in a flash of Freddie Van Dam, whom he had met at Castle Havens, for the Fidelity was Freddie's company. "The first thing that I have to ask you," continued the judge, "is that, whether you care to take the case or not, will you consider my own intervention in the matter absolutely entre nous? My position is simply this. I have protested at the meetings of the directors of the company against what I consider an unwise policy, and my protests have been ignored. And when my friend asked me for advice, I gave it to him. But at the same time, I am not in a position to be publicly quoted in connection with the matter. You follow me?" "Perfectly," said the other. "I will agree to what you ask." "Very good. Now then, the condition is, in brief, this. The companies are accumulating an enormous surplus, which under the law belongs to the policyholders. But the administrations of the various companies are withholding these dividends for the sake of the banking power which these accumulated funds afford to them and their associates. That is, as I hold, a very manifest injustice and a most dangerous condition of affairs." "I should say so," responded Montague. He was amazed at such a statement coming from such a source. "How could this continue?" he asked. "It has continued for a long time," the judge answered. "But why is it not known?" "It is perfectly well known to everyone in the insurance business," was the answer. "The matter has never been taken up or published, simply because the interests involved have such enormous and widely extended power that no one has ever dared to attack them." Montague sat forward with his eyes riveted upon the judge. "Go on," he said. "The situation is simply this," said the other. "My friend, Mr. Hasbrook, wishes to bring a suit against the Fidelity Company to compel it to pay to him his proper share of its surplus. He wishes the suit pressed and followed to the court of last resort." "And do you mean to tell me," asked Montague, "that you would have any difficulty to find a lawyer in New York to undertake such a case?" "No," said the other, "not exactly that. There are lawyers in New York who would undertake anything. But to find a lawyer of standing who would take it, and would stand all the pressure that would be brought to bear upon him, that might take some time." "You astonish me, Judge. Financial interests in this city are pretty closely tied together, Mr. Montague. Of course there are law firms which are identified with interests opposed to those who control the company. It would be very easy to get them to take the case. But you can see that in that event my friend would be accused of bringing the suit in their interest, whereas he wishes it to appear as it really is, a suit of an independent person, seeking the rights of the vast body of the policyholders. For that reason he wishes to find a lawyer who is identified with no interest of any sort, and who is free to give his undivided attention to the issue. So I thought of you." "I will take the case," said Montague instantly. "It is my duty to warn you," said the judge gravely, "that you will be taking a very serious step. You must be prepared to face powerful and, I am afraid, unscrupulous enemies. You may find that you have made it impossible for other and very desirable clients to deal with you. You may find your business interests, if you have any, embarrassed, your credit impaired, and so on. You must be prepared to have your character assailed and your motives impugned in the public press. You may find that social pressure will be brought to bear on you. So it is a step from which most young men who have their careers to make would shrink." Montague's face had turned a shade paler as he listened. "I am assuming," he said, "that the facts are as you have stated them to me, that an unjust condition exists." "You may assume that." "Very well." And Montague clenched his hand and put it down upon the table. "I will take the case," he said. For a few moments they sat in silence. "I will arrange," said the judge at last, "for you and Mr. Hasbrook to meet. I must explain to you, as a matter of fairness, that he is a rich man and will be able to pay you for your services. He is asking a great deal of you, and he should expect to pay for it." Montague sat in thought. "I have not really had time to get my bearings in New York," he said at last. "I think I had best leave it to you to say what I should charge him." "If I were in your position," the judge answered, "I think that I should ask a retaining fee of $50,000. I believe he will expect to pay at least that." Montague could scarcely repress a start. $50,000! The words made his head whirl round. But then, all of a sudden, he recalled his half-jesting resolve to play the game of business sternly. So he nodded his head gravely and said, "Very well, I'm much obliged to you." After a pause he added, I hope that I may prove able to handle the case to your friend's satisfaction." "Your ability remains for you to prove," said the judge. "I have only been in position to assure him of your character." "He must understand, of course," said Montague, "that I am a stranger, and that it will take me a while to study the situation." "Of course he knows that. But you will find that Mr. Hasbrook knows a good deal about the law himself, and he has already had a lot of work done. You must understand that it is very easy to get legal advice about such a matter. What is sought is some one to take the conduct of the case." "I see," said Montague, and the judge added with a smile, "some one to get up on horseback and draw the fire of the enemy." And then the great man was, as usual, reminded of a story, and then of more stories, until at last they rose from the table and shook hands upon their bargain and parted. $50,000! $50,000! It was all Montague could do to keep from exclaiming it aloud on the street. He could hardly believe that it was a reality. If it had been a less known person than Judge Ellis, he would have suspected that someone must be playing a joke upon him. $50,000 was more than many a lawyer made at home in a lifetime, and simply as a retaining fee in one case. The problem of living had weighed upon his soul ever since the first day in the city, and now suddenly it was solved, all in a few minutes. The way had been swept clear before him. He walked home as if upon air. And then there was the excitement of telling the family about it. He had an idea that his brother might be alarmed if he were told about the seriousness of the case, and so he simply said that the judge had brought him a rich client, and that it was an insurance case. Oliver, who knew and cared nothing about law, asked no questions, and contented himself with saying, "I told you how easy it was to make money in New York, if only you knew the right people." As for Alice, she had known all along that her cousin was a great man, and that clients would come to him as soon as he hung out his sign. His sign was not out yet, by the way, and that was the next thing to be attended to. He must get himself an office at once, and some books, and begin to read up insurance law. And so, bright and early the next morning, he took the subway downtown. And here for the first time Montague saw the real New York. All the rest was mere shadow. The rest was where men slept and played. But there was where they fought out the battle of their lives. Here the fierce intensity of it smote him in the face. He saw the cruel waste and ruin of it, the wreckage of the blind, haphazard strife. It was a city caught in a trap. It was pent in at one end of a narrow little island. It had been no one's business to foresee that it must some day outgrow this space. Now men were digging a score of tunnels to set it free, but they had not begun these until the pressure had become unendurable, and now it had reached its climax. In the financial district, land had been sold for as much as $4 a square inch. Huge blocks of buildings shot up to the sky in a few months, 15, 20, 25 stories of them, and with half a dozen stories hewn out of the solid rock beneath. There was to be one building of 42 stories, 650 feet in height, and between them were narrow chasms of streets, where the hurrying crowds overflowed the sidewalks. Yet other streets were filled with trucks and heavy vehicles, with electric cars creeping slowly along, and little swirls and eddies of people darting across here and there. These huge buildings were like beehives, swarming with life and activity, with scores of elevators shooting through them at bewildering speed. Everywhere was the atmosphere of rush. The spirit of it seized hold of one, and he began to hurry, even though he had no place to go. The man who walked slowly and looked about him was in the way. He was jostled here and there, and people eyed him with suspicion and annoyance. Elsewhere on the island, men did the work of the city. Here they did the work of the world. Each room in these endless mazes of buildings was a cell in a mighty brain. The telephone wires were nerves, and by the whole huge organism the thinking and willing of a continent were done. It was a noisy place to the physical ear, but to the ear of the mind it roared with the roaring of 1,000 Niagaras. Here was the stock exchange, where the scales of trade were held before the eyes of the country. Here was the clearing house, where hundreds of millions of dollars were exchanged every day. Here were the great banks, the reservoirs into which the streams of the country's wealth were poured. Here were the brains of the great railroad system, of the telegraph and telephone systems, of mines and mills and factories. Here were the centers of the country's trade. In one place the shipping trade, in another the jewelry trade, the grocery trade, the leather trade. A little farther uptown was the clothing district, where one might see the signs of more Hebrews than all Jerusalem had ever held. In yet other districts were the newspaper offices, and the center of the magazine and book publishing business of the whole country. One might climb to the top of one of the great skyscrapers and gaze down upon a wilderness of houses, with roofs as innumerable as treetops, and people looking like tiny insects below. One might go out into the harbor late upon a winter afternoon, and see it as a city of 1,000,000 lights, rising like an incantation from the sea. Round about it was an unbroken ring of docks, with ferry boats and tugs darting everywhere, and vessels which had come from every port in the world, emptying their cargoes into the huge maw of the Metropolis. And of all this nothing had been planned. All lay just as it had fallen, and men bore the confusion and the waste as best they could. Here were huge steel vaults, in which lay many billions of dollars worth of securities, the control of the finances of the country, and a block or two in one direction were warehouses and gin mills, and in another direction cheap lodging houses and sweating dens. And at a certain hour all this huge machine would come to a halt, and its millions of human units would make a blind rush for their homes. Then at the entrances to bridges and ferries and trams would be seen sights of madness and terror. Throngs of men and women swept hither and thither, pushing and struggling, shouting, cursing, fighting now and then in sudden panic fear. All decency was forgotten here. People would be mashed into cars like football players in a heap, and guards and policemen would jam the gates tight, or like as not be swept away themselves in the pushing, grunting, writhing mass of human beings. Women would faint and be trampled. Men would come out with clothing torn to shreds, and sometimes with broken arms or ribs. And thinking people would gaze at the sight and shudder, wondering how long a city could hold together, where the masses of its population were thus forced back day after day habitually upon the elemental brute within them. In this vast business district Montague would have felt utterly lost and helpless if it had not been for that $50,000 and the sense of mastery which it gave him. He sought out General Prentice, and under his guidance selected his suite of rooms, and got his furniture and books in readiness. And a day or two later, by appointment, came Mr. Hasbrook. He was a wiry, nervous little man, who did not impress one as much of a personality. But he had the insurance situation in his fingers' ends. His grievance had evidently wrought upon him. Certainly, if half of what he alleged were true, it was time that the courts took hold of the affair. Montague spent the whole day in consultation, going over every aspect of the case and laying out his course of procedure. And then, at the end, Mr. Hasbrook remarked that it would be necessary for them to make some financial arrangement. And the other set his teeth together and took a tight grip upon himself and said, "Considering the importance of the case, and all the circumstances, I think I should have a retainer of $50,000. And the little man never turned a hair. "That will be perfectly satisfactory," he said. "I will attend to it at once." And the other's heart gave a great leap. And sure enough, the next morning's mail brought the money, in the shape of a cashier's check from one of the big banks. Montague deposited it to his own account, and felt that the city was his. And so he flung himself into the work. He went to his office every day, and he shut himself up in his own rooms in the evening. Mrs. Winnie was in despair because he would not come and learn bridge, and Mrs. Vivie Patton sought him in vain for a week-end party. He could not exactly say that while the others slept, he was toiling upward in the night, for the others did not sleep in the night. But he could say that while they were feasting and dancing, he was delving into insurance law. Oliver argued in vain to make him realize that he could not live forever upon one client, and that it was as important for a lawyer to be a social light as to win his first big case. Montague was so absorbed that he even failed to be thrilled when one morning he opened an invitation envelope and read the fateful legend: "Mrs. Devon requests the honor of your company," telling him that he had passed on that critical examination morning, and that he was definitely and irrevocably in society. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Montague was now a capitalist, and therefore a keeper of the gates of opportunity. It seems as though the seekers for admission must have some occult way of finding it out. Almost immediately they began to lay siege to him. About a week after his check arrived, Major Thorne, whom he had met the first evening at the Loyal Legion, called him up and asked to see him, and he came to Montague's room that evening, and after chatting a while about old times, proceeded to unfold a business proposition. It seemed that the Major had a grandson, a young mechanical engineer, who had been laboring for a couple of years at a very important invention, a device for loading coal upon steamships and weighing it automatically in the process. It was a very complicated problem, needless to say, but it had been solved successfully, and patents had been applied for and a working model constructed. But it had proved unexpectedly difficult to interest the officials of the great steamship companies in the device. There was no doubt about the practicability of the machine, or the economics it would affect. But the officials raised trivial objections, and caused delays, and offered prices that were ridiculously inadequate. So the young inventor had conceived the idea of organizing a company to manufacture the machines, and rent them upon a royalty. "I don't know whether you would have any money," said Major Thorne, "but I thought you might be in touch with others who could be got to look into the matter. There is a fortune in it for those who take it up." Montague was interested, and he looked over the plans and descriptions which his friend had brought, and said that he would see the working model, and talk the proposition over with others. And so the Major took his departure. The first person Montague spoke to about it was Oliver, with whom he chanced to be lunching at the latter's club. This was the all-night club, a meeting place for fast young society men and millionaire bohemians, who made a practice of going to bed at daylight, and had taken for their motto the words of Tennyson: "For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever." It was not a proper club for his brother to join. Oliver considered Montague's game was the heavy respectable, and the person to put him up was General Prentice. But he was permitted to lunch there with his brother to chaperone him, and also Reggie Mann, who happened in, fresh from talking over the itinerary of the foreign prince with Mrs. Ridgely Clieveden. and bringing a diverting account of how Mrs. R.C. had had a fisticuffs with her maid. Montague mentioned the invention casually, and with no idea that his brother would have an opinion one way or the other. But Oliver had quite a vigorous opinion. "Good God, Allen, you aren't going to let yourself be persuaded into a thing like that?" "But what do you know about it?" asked the other. "It may be a tremendous thing." "Of course," cried Oliver. "But what can you tell about it? You'll be like a child in other people's hands, and they'll be certain to rob you. And why in the world do you want to take risks when you don't have to?" "I have to put my money somewhere," said Montague. "His first fee is burning a hole in his pocket," put in Reggie Mann with a chuckle. "Turn it over to me, Mr. Montague, and let me spend it in a gorgeous entertainment for Alice, and the prestige of it will bring you more cases than you can handle in a lifetime." "He had much better spend it all for soda water than buy a lot of coal chutes with it," said Oliver. "Wait a while, and let me find you some place to put your money, and you'll see that you don't have to take any risks." "I had no idea of taking it up until I've made certain of it," replied the other. "And those whose judgment I took would of course go in also." The younger man thought for a moment. "You are going to dine with Major Venable tonight, aren't you?" he asked. And when the other answered in the affirmative, he continued, "Very well, then, ask him. The Major's been a capitalist for 40 years, and if you can get him to take it up, why, you'll know you're safe." Major Venable had taken quite a fancy to Montague. Perhaps the old gentleman liked to have somebody to gossip with, to whom all his anecdotes were new. He had seconded Montague's name at the Millionaire's, where he lived, and had asked him there to make the acquaintance of some of the other members. Before Montague parted with his brother, he promised that he would talk the matter over with the Major. The Millionaire's was the show club of the city, the one which the ineffably rich had set apart for themselves. It was up by the park, in a magnificent white marble palace which had cost $1,000,000. Montague felt they had never really known the Major until he saw him here. The Major was excellent at all times and places, but in this club he became an edition de luxe of himself. He made his headquarters here, keeping his suite of rooms all the year round, and the atmosphere and surroundings of the place seemed to be a part of him. Montague thought that the Major's face grew redder every day, and the purple veins in it purpler. Or was it that the old gentleman's shirt bosom gleamed more brightly in the glare of the lights? The Major met him in the stately entrance hall, 50 feet square, and all of Numidian marble, with a ceiling of gold, and a great bronze stairway leading to the gallery above. He apologized for his velvet slippers and for his hobbling walk. He was getting his accursed gout again. But he limped around and introduced his friend to the other millionaires, and then told scandal about them behind their backs. The Major was the very type of blue-blooded old aristocrat. He was all noblesse oblige to those within the magic circle of his intimacy, but alas for those outside it. Montague had never heard anyone bully servants as the Major did. "Here, you!" he would cry, when something went wrong at the table. "Don't you know any better than to bring me a dish like that? Go and send me somebody who knows how to set a table." And strange to say, the servants all acknowledged his perfect right to bully them, and flew with terrified alacrity to do his bidding. Montague noticed that the whole staff of the club leaped into activity whenever the Major appeared, and when he was seated at the table, he led off in this fashion: "Now, I want 2 dry martinis, and I want them at once. Do you understand me? Don't stop to get me any butter plates or finger bowls. I want 2 cocktails, just as quick as you can carry them." Dinner was an important event to Major Venable. the most important in life. The younger man humbly declined to make any suggestions, and sat and watched while his friend did all the ordering. They had some very small oysters, and an onion soup, and a grouse and asparagus, with some wine from the Major's own private store, and then a romaine salad. Concerning each of these courses the Major gave special injunctions, and throughout his conversation he scattered comments upon them. "This is a good thick soup, lots of nourishment in onion soup. Have the rest of this. I think the Burgundy is too cold. 65 is as cold as Burgundy ought ever to be. I don't mind sherry as low as 60. They always cook a bird too much. Robbie Walling's chef is the only person I know who never makes a mistake with game." All this, of course, was between comments upon the assembled millionaires. There was Hawkins, the corporate lawyer, a shrewd fellow, cold as a corpse. He was named for an ambassadorship, a very efficient man. Used to be old Wyman's confidential adviser and buy aldermen for him. And the man at the table with him was Harrison, publisher of the Star, administration newspaper, sound and conservative. Harrison was training for a cabinet position. He was a nice little man, and would make a fine splurge in Washington. And that tall man coming in was Clark, the steel magnate, and over there was Adams, a big lawyer also, prominent reformer, civic righteousness and all that sort of stuff. Represented the oil trust secretly, and went down to Trenton to argue against some reform measure, and took along $50,000 in bills in his valise. A friend of mine got wind of what he was doing and taxed him with it," said the Major, and laughed gleefully over the great lawyer's reply. "How did I know but I might have to pay for my own lunch?" And the fat man with him, that was Jimmy Featherstone, the chap who had inherited a big estate. "Poor Jimmy's going all to pieces," the Major declared. "Goes downtown to board meetings now and then, and they tell a hair-raising story about him and old Dan Waterman." He had got up and started a long argument when Waterman broke in. "But at the earlier meeting you argued directly to the contrary, Mr. Featherstone." "Did I?" said Jimmy, looking bewildered. "I wonder why I did that." "Well, Mr. Featherstone, since you ask me, I'll tell you," said old Dan. "He's savage as a wild boar, you know, and won't be delayed at meetings. The reason is that the last time you were drunker than you are now. If you would adopt a uniform standard of intoxication for the directors' meetings of this road, it would expedite matters considerably." They had got as far as the romaine salad. The waiter came with a bowl of dressing, and at the sight of it the old gentleman forgot Jimmy Featherstone. "Why are you bringing me that stuff?" he cried. "I don't want that. Take it away, and get me some vinegar and oil." The waiter fled in dismay, while the Major went on growling under his breath. Then from behind him came a voice. "What's the matter with you this evening, Venable? You're peevish." The Major looked up. "Hello, you old cormorant," said he. "How do you do these days?" The old cormorant replied that he did very well. He was a pudgy little man with a pursed up, wrinkled face. "My friend Mr. Montague, Mr. Sims," said the Major. "I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Montague," said Mr. Sims, peering over his spectacles. "And what are you doing with yourself these days?" asked the Major. The other smiled genially. "Nothing much," said he. "Seducing my friends' wives, as usual." "And who's the latest?" "Read the newspapers and you'll find out," laughed Sims. "I'm told I'm being shadowed." He passed on down the room, chuckling to himself, and the Major said, "That's Malty Sims. Have you heard of him?" "No," said Montague. "He gets into the papers a good deal. He was up in supplementary proceedings the other day. Couldn't pay his liquor bill." "A member of the Millionaires?" laughed Montague. "Yes, "The papers made quite a joke out of it," said the other. "But you see he's run through a couple of fortunes. The last was his mother's, 11 millions, I believe. He's been a pretty lively old boy in his time." The vinegar and oil had now arrived, and the Major set to work to dress the salad. This was quite a ceremony, and Montague took it with amused interest. The Major first gathered all the necessary articles together and looked them all over and grumbled at them. Then he mixed the vinegar and the pepper and salt, and a tablespoonful at a time, and poured it over the salad. Then very slowly and carefully the oil had to be poured on, the salad being poked and turned about so that all would be absorbed. Perhaps it was because he was so busy narrating the escapades of Maltby Sims that the old gentleman kneaded it about so long, all the time fussing over it like a hen partridge with her chicks, and interrupting himself every sentence or two. It was Lenore, the opera star, and he gave her about $200,000 worth of railroad shares. Really, you know, romaine ought not to be served in a bowl at all, but in a square, flat dish, so that one could keep the ends quite dry. And when they quarreled, she found the old scamp had fooled her. The shares had never been transferred. One is not supposed to use a fork at all, you know. But she sued him, and he settled with her for about half the value. If this dressing were done properly, there ought not to be any oil in the bottom of the dish at all. This last remark meant that the process had reached its climax, that the long, crisp leaves were receiving their final affectionate overturnings. While the waiter stood at respectful attention, 2 or 3 pieces at a time were laid carefully upon the little silver plate intended for Montague. "And now," said the triumphant host, "try it. If it's good, it ought to be neither sweet nor bitter, but just right." And he watched anxiously while Montague tasted it, saying, "If it's the least bitter, say so, and we'll send it out. I told them about it often enough before." But it was not bitter, and so the Major proceeded to help himself, after which the waiter whisked the bowl away. "I'm told that salad is the one vegetable we have from the Romans," said the old boy, as he munched at the crisp green leaves. "It was mentioned by Horace, you know. As I was saying, all this was in Sims's early days, but since his son's been grown up, he's married another chorus girl." After the salad, the Major had another cocktail. In the beginning, Montague had noticed that his hand shook and his eyes were watery, but now, after these copious libations, he was vigorous and, if possible, more full of anecdotes than ever. Montague thought that it would be a good time to broach his inquiry, and so when the coffee had been served, he asked, "Have you any objections to talking business after dinner?" "Not with you," said the Major. "Why? What is it?" And then Montague told him about his friend's proposition, and described the invention. The other listened attentively to the end, and then, after a pause, Montague asked him, "What do you think of it?" "The invention's no good," said the Major promptly. "How do you know?" asked the other. "Because if it had been, the companies would have taken it long ago, without paying him a cent." "But he has it patented," said Montague. "Patented hell," replied the other. "What's a patent to lawyers of concerns of that size? They'd have taken it, and had it in use from Maine to Texas, and when he sued, they'd have tied the case up in so many technicalities and quibbles that he couldn't have got to the end of it in 10 years, and he'd have been ruined 10 times over in the process." "Is that really done?" asked Montague. "Done!" exclaimed the Major. "It's done so often you might say it's the only thing that's done. The people are probably trying to take you in with a fake." "That couldn't possibly be so," responded the other. "The man is a friend." "I have found it an excellent rule never to do business with friends," said the Major grimly. "But listen," said Montague, and he argued long enough to convince his companion that that could not be the true explanation. Then the Major sat for a minute or two and pondered, and suddenly he exclaimed, "I have it. I see why they won't touch it." "What is it?" "It's the coal companies. They are giving the steamships short weight, and they don't want the coal weighed truly." "But there's no sense in that," said Montague. "It's the steamship companies that won't take the machine." "Yes," said the Major, "naturally their officers are sharing the graft." And he laughed heartily at Montague's look of perplexity. "Do you know anything about the business?" Montague asked. "Nothing whatever," said the Major. "I'm like the German who shut himself up in his inner consciousness and deduced the shape of an elephant from first principles. I know the game of big business from A to Z, and I'm telling you that if the invention is good and the companies won't take it, that's the reason. And I'll lay you a wager that if you were to make an investigation, some such thing as that is what you would find. Last winter I went south on a steamer, and when we got near port, I saw them dumping a ton or two of good food overboard, and I made inquiries, and learned that one of the officials of the company ran a farm, and furnished the stuff, and the orders were to get rid of so much every trip." Montague's jaw had fallen. What could Major Thorne do against such a combination, he asked. "I don't know," said the Major, shrugging his shoulders. "It's a case to take to a lawyer, one who knows the ropes. Hawkins over there would know what to tell you. I should imagine the thing he'd advise would be to call a strike of the men who handle the coal, and tie up the companies and bring them to terms." "You're joking now!" exclaimed the other. "Not at all," said the Major, laughing again. "It's done all the time. There's a building trust in this city, and the way it puts all its rivals out of business was by having strikes called on their jobs." "But how could it do that?" "Easiest thing in the world. A labor leader is a man with a great deal of power and a very small salary to live on. And even if he won't sell out, there are other ways. I could introduce you to a man right in this room who had a big strike on at an inconvenient time, and he had the president of the union trapped in a hotel with a woman, and the poor fellow gave in and called off the strike." "I should think the strikers might sometimes get out of hand," said Montague. "Sometimes they do," smiled the other. "There is a regular procedure for that case. Then you hire detectives and start violence, and call out the militia, and put the strike leaders into jail." Montague could think of nothing to say to that. The program seemed to be complete. "You see," the Major continued earnestly, "I'm advising you as a friend, and I'm taking the point of view of a man who has money in his pocket. I have had some there always, but I've had to work hard to keep it there. All my life I've been surrounded by people who want to do me good, and the way they wanted to do it was to exchange my real money for pieces of paper which they had printed with fancy scroll work and eagles and flags. Of course, if you want to look at the thing from the other side, why then, the invention is most ingenious, and trade is booming just now, and this is a great country, and merit is all you need in it, and everything else is just as it ought to be. It makes all the difference in the world, you know, whether a man is buying a horse or selling him." Montague had observed with perplexity that such incendiary talk as this was one of the characteristics of people in these lofty altitudes. It was one of the liberties accorded to their station. Editors and bishops and statesmen and all the rest of their retainers had to believe in the respectabilities, even in the privacy of their clubs. The people's ears were getting terribly sharp these days. But among the real giants of business, you might have thought yourself in a society of revolutionists. They would tear up the mountain tops and hurl them at each other. When one of these old war horses once got started, he would tell tales of deviltry to appall the soul of the hardiest muckrake man. It was always the other fellow, of course, but then, if you pinned your man down, and if he thought that he could trust you, he would acknowledge that he had sometimes fought the enemy with the enemy's own weapons. But of course one must understand that all this radicalism was for conversational purposes only. The Major, for instance, never had the slightest idea of doing anything about all the evil of which he told. When it came to action, he proposed to do just what he had done all his life, to sit tight on his own little pile, and the millionaires was an excellent place to learn to do it. "See that old money bags over there in the corner?" said the Major. "He's a man you want to fix in your mind. Old Henry S. Grimes. Have you heard of him?" "Vaguely," said the other. "He's Laura Hegan's uncle. She'll have his money also some day, but Lord, how he does hold on to it meantime. It's quite tragic if you come to know him. He's frightened at his own shadow. He goes in for slum tenements, and I guess he evicts more people in a month than you could crowd into this building." Montague looked at the solitary figure at the table, a man with a wizened-up little face like a weasel's, and a big napkin tied around his neck. "That's so as to save his shirt front for tomorrow," the Major explained. "He's really only about 60, but you think he was 80. 3 times a day he sits here and eats a bowl of graham crackers and milk, and then he goes out and sits rigid in an armchair for an hour. That's the regime his doctors have put him on. Angels and ministers of grace defend us." The old gentleman paused, and a chuckle shook his scarlet jowls. "Only think," he said, "they tried to do that to me. But no, sir, when Bob Venable has to eat graham crackers and milk, he'll put in arsenic instead of sugar. That's the way with many a one of these rich fellows, though. You picture him living in Capuan luxury, when, as a matter of fact, he's a man with a torpid liver and a weak stomach, who is put to bed at 10 o'clock with a hot water bag and a flannel nightcap." The two had got up and were strolling toward the smoking room, when suddenly at one side a door opened and a group of men came out. At the head of them was an extraordinary figure, a big powerful body with a grim face. "Hello," said the Major. "All the big bugs are here tonight. There must be a governor's meeting." "Who is that?" asked his companion, and he answered, "Why, that's Dan Waterman." Dan Waterman? Montague stared harder than ever, and now he identified the face with the picture he had seen. Waterman, the Colossus of finance, the Croesus of copper and gold. How many trusts had Waterman organized, and how many puns had been made upon that name of his? "Who are the other men?" Montague asked. "Oh, they're just little millionaires," was the reply. The little millionaires were following as a kind of bodyguard. One of them, who was short and pudgy, was half running to keep up with Waterman's heavy stride. When they came to the cloakroom, they crowded the attendants away, and one helped the great man on with his coat, and another held his hat, and another his stick, and 2 others tried to talk to him, and Waterman stolidly buttoned his coat, and then seized his hat and stick, and without a word to anyone bolted through the door. It was one of the funniest sights that Montague had ever seen in his life, and he laughed all the way into the smoking room. And when Major Venable had settled himself in a big chair and bitten off the end of a cigar and lighted it, what floodgates of reminiscence were opened! For Dan Waterman was one of the Major's own generation, and he knew all his life and his habits. Just as Montague had seen him there, so he had been always, swift, imperious, terrible, trampling over all opposition. The most powerful man in the city quailed before the glare of his eyes. In the old days, Wall Street had reeled in the shock of the conflicts between him and his most powerful rival. And the Major went on to tell about Waterman's rival and his life. He had been the city's traction king. Old Wyman had been made by him. He was the prince among political financiers. He had ruled the Democratic Party in state and nation. He would give $250,000 at a time to the boss of Tammany Hall, and spend $1,000,000 in a single campaign. On dough day, when the district leaders came to get the election funds, there would be a table 40 feet long, completely covered with $100 bills. He would have been the richest man in America, save that he spent his money as fast as he got it. He had the most famous racing stable in America, and a house on Fifth Avenue that was said to be the finest Italian palace in the world. Over $3 million had been spent in decorating it. All the ceilings had been brought intact from palaces abroad, which he had bought and demolished. The Major told his story to show how such a man lost all sense of the value of money. He had once been sitting at lunch with him, when the editor of one of his newspapers had come in and remarked, "I told you we would need $8,000, and the check you send is for 10. "I know it," was the smiling answer, "but somehow I thought 8 seemed harder to write than 10. "Old Waterman's quite a spender, too, when it comes to that," the Major went on. "He told me once that it cost him $5,000 a day for his ordinary expenses, and that doesn't include $1,000,000 yacht, nor even the expenses of it. And think of another man I know of who spends $1,000,000 for a granite pier, so that he could land and see his mistress. It's a fact, as sure as God made me. She was a well-known society woman, but she was poor, and he didn't dare to make her rich for fear of the scandal. So he had her to live in a miserable $50,000 villa. And when other people's children would sneer at her children because they lived in a $50,000 villa, the answer would be, 'But you haven't got any pier.' And if you don't believe that—" But here suddenly the Major turned and observed a boy who had brought him some cigars, and who was now standing near by, pretending to straighten out some newspapers upon the table. "Here, sir," cried the Major, "what do you mean, listening to what I am saying? Out of the room with you now, you rascal!" End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Metropolis by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Another weekend came, and with it an invitation from the Lester Todds to visit them at their country place in New Jersey. Montague was buried in his books, but his brother routed him out with strenuous protests. His case be damned. Was he going to ruin his career for one case? At all hazards he must meet people who counted. And the Todds were such a big money crowd and a power in the insurance world. If Montague were going to be an insurance lawyer, he could not possibly decline their invitation. Freddie Van Dam would be a guest, and Montague smiled at the tidings that Betty Wyman would be there also. He had observed that his brother's week-end visits always happened at places where Betty was, and where Betty's granddaddy was not. So Montague's man packed his grips, and Alice's made her trunks, and they rode with a private car party to a remote Jersey suburb, and were whirled in an auto up a broad shell road to a palace upon the top of a mountain. Here lived the haughty Lester Todds, and scattered about on the neighboring hills a set of the ultra-wealthy had withdrawn to this seclusion. They were exceedingly classy. They affected to regard all the society of the city with scorn, and had their own all-year-round diversions, an open-air horse show in summer, and in the fall fox hunting in fancy uniforms. The Lester Todds themselves were ardent pursuers of all varieties of game, and in various clubs and private preserves they followed the seasons. from Florida and North Carolina to Ontario, with occasional side trips to Norway and New Brunswick and British Columbia. Here at home they had a whole mountain of virgin forest carefully preserved. And in the Renaissance palace at the summit, which they carelessly referred to as a lodge, you would find such articles de verdure as a $10,000 table with a set of $2,000 chairs, and quite ordinary looking rugs at $10,000 and $20,000 each. All these prices you might ascertain without any difficulty at all, because there were many newspaper articles describing the house to be read in an album in the hall. On Saturday afternoons Mrs. Todd welcomed the neighbors in a pastel gray reception gown, the front of which contained a peacock embroidered in silk, with jewels in every feather, and a diamond solitaire for an eye. And in the evening there was a dance, and she appeared in a gown with several hundred diamonds sewn upon it, and received her guests upon a rug set with jewels to match. Altogether, Montague judged this the fastest set he had yet encountered. They ate more, and drank more, and intrigued more openly. He had been slowly acquiring the special lingo of society, but these people had so much more slang that he felt all lost again. A young lady who was gossiping to him about those present remarked that a certain youth was a spasm, and then seeing the look of perplexity upon his face, she laughed. "I don't believe you know what I mean." Montague replied that he had ventured to infer that she did not like him. And then there was Mrs. Harper, who came from Chicago by way of London. 10 years ago Mrs. Harper had overwhelmed New York with the millions brought from her great department store, and had then moved on, sighing for new worlds to conquer. When she had left Chicago, her grammar had been unexceptionable, but since she had been in England she said, "You ain't," and dropped all her G's, and when Montague brought down a bird at long range, she exclaimed condescendingly, "Why, you're quite a dab at it." He sat in the front seat of an automobile, and heard the great lady behind him referring to the sturdy Jersey farmers whose ancestors had fought the British and Hessians all over the state as "your peasantry." It was an extraordinary privilege to have Mrs. Harper for a guest. At home she moved about in state recalling that of Queen Victoria, with flags and bunting on the way, and crowds of school children cheering. She kept up half a dozen establishments, and had 100,000 acres of game preserves in Scotland. She made a specialty of collecting jewels which had belonged to the romantic and picturesque queens of history. She appeared at the dance in a breastplate of diamonds, covering the entire front of her bodice, so that she was literally clothed in light. And with her was her English friend, Mrs. Percy, who had accompanied her in her triumph through the courts and camps of Europe, and displayed a famous lorgnette chain containing one specimen of every rare and beautiful jewel known. Mrs. Percy wore a gown of cloth of gold tissue, covered with a fortune in Venetian lace, and made a tremendous sensation, until the rumor spread that it was a rehash of the costume which Mrs. Harper had worn at the Duchess of London's ball. The Chicago lady herself never by any chance appeared in the same costume twice. Alice had a grand time at the Todds, and all the men fell in love with her. One in particular, a young chap named Fayette, quite threw himself at her feet. He was wealthy, but unfortunately he had made his money by eloping with a rich girl, who was one of the present party, and so, from a practical point of view, his attentions were not desirable for Alice. Montague was left with the task of finding these things out for himself, for his brother devoted himself exclusively to Betty Wyman. The way these two disappeared between meals was a jest of the whole company. so that when they were on their way home, Montague felt called upon to make parental inquiries. "We are as much engaged as we dare be," Oliver answered him. "And when do you expect to marry her?" "God knows," said he. "I don't. The old man wouldn't give her a cent." "And you couldn't support her?" "I? Good heavens, Allen! Do you suppose Betty would consent to be poor?" "Have you asked her?" inquired Montague. "I don't want to ask her, thank you. I've not the least desire to live in a hovel with a girl who's been brought up in a palace." "Then what do you expect to do?" "Well, Betty has a rich aunt in a lunatic asylum. And then I'm making money, you know, and the old boy will have to relent in the end. And we're having a very good time in the meanwhile, you know." "You can't be very much in love," said Montague, to which his brother replied cheerfully that they were as much in love as they felt like being. This was on the train Monday morning. Oliver observed that his brother relapsed into a brown study, and remarked, "I suppose you're going back now to bury yourself in your books. You've got to give me one evening this week for dinner that's important." "Where's that?" asked the other. "Oh, it's a long story," said Oliver. "I'll explain it to you some time. But first we must have an understanding about next week also. I suppose you've not overlooked the fact that it's Christmas week, and you won't be permitted to do any work then." "But that's impossible!" exclaimed the other. "Nothing else is possible," said Oliver firmly. "I've made an engagement for you with the Eldridge Devons up the Hudson." "For the whole week?" "The whole week, and it'll be the most important thing you've done. Mrs. Winnie's going to take us all in her car, and you will make no end of indispensable acquaintances." "Oliver, I don't see how in the world I can do it," the other protested in dismay, and went on for several minutes arguing and explaining what he had to do. But Oliver contented himself with the assurance that where there's a will there's a way. One could not refuse an invitation to spend Christmas with the Eldridge Devons. And sure enough there was a way. Mr. Hasbrook had mentioned to him that he had had considerable work done upon the case, and would have the papers sent round. And when Montague reached his office that morning, he found them there. There was a package of several thousand pages, and upon examining them, he found to his utter consternation that they contained a complete bill of complaint, with all the necessary references and citations, and a preliminary draft of a brief; in short, a complete and thorough-going preparation of his case. There could not have been less than $10,000 or $15,000 worth of work in the papers, and Montague sat quite aghast, turning over the neatly typewritten sheets. He could indeed afford to attend Christmas house parties if all his clients were to treat him like this. He felt a little piqued about it, for he had noted some of these points for himself, and felt a little proud about them. Apparently he was to be nothing but a figurehead in the case, and he turned to the phone and called up Mr. Hasbrook, and asked him what he expected him to do with these papers. There was the whole case here, and was he simply to take them as they stood? No one could have replied more considerately than did Mr. Hasbrook. The papers were for Montague's benefit. He would do exactly as he pleased with them. He might use them as they stood, or reject them altogether, or make them the basis for his own work. Anything that appealed to his judgment would be satisfactory. And so Montague turned about and wrote an acceptance to the formal invitation which had come from the Eldridge Devons. Later on in the day, Oliver called up and said he was to go out to dinner the following evening, and that he would call for him at 8. "It's with the Jack Evanses," Oliver added. "Do you know them?" Montague had heard the name as that of the president of a chain of western railroads. "Do you mean him?" he asked. "Yes," said the other. "They're a rum crowd, but there's money in it. I'll call earlier and explain it to you." But it was explained sooner than that. During the next afternoon Montague had a caller, none other than Miss Winnie Duval. Someone had left Mrs. Winnie some more money, it appeared, and there was a lot of red tape attached to it, which she wanted the new lawyer to attend to. Also, she said, she hoped that he would charge her a lot of money by way of encouraging himself. It was a mere bagatelle of 100,000 or so, from some forgotten aunt in the West. The business was soon disposed of, and then Mrs. Winnie asked Montague if he had any place to go for dinner that evening, which was the occasion of his mentioning the Jack Evanses. "Oh, dear me," said Mrs. Winnie, with a laugh. "Is Ollie going to take you there? What a funny time you'll have!" "Do you know them?" asked the other. "Heavens, no," was the answer. "Nobody knows them. But everybody knows about them. My husband meets old Evans in business, of course, and thinks he's a good sort. But the family, dear me!" "How much of it is there?" "Why, there's the old lady, and 2 grown daughters, and a son. The son's a fine chap, they say. The old man took him in hand and put him at work in the shops. But I suppose he thought the daughters were too much of a proposition for him, and so he sent them to a fancy school. And I tell you, they're the most highly polished human specimens that ever you encountered." It sounded entertaining. "But what does Oliver want with them?" asked Montague, wonderingly. "It isn't that he wants them; they want him. They're cumbers, you know, perfectly frantic. They've come to town to get into society." "Then you mean that they pay Oliver?" asked Montague. "I don't know that," said the other, with a laugh. "You'll have to ask Ollie. They've a number of the little brothers of the rich hanging round them, picking up whatever plunder's in sight." A look of pain crossed Montague's face, and she saw it, and put out her hand with a sudden gesture. "Oh!" she exclaimed, "I've offended you." "No," said he, "it's not that exactly. I wouldn't be offended, but I'm worried about my brother." "How do you mean?" "He gets a lot of money somehow, and I don't know what it means." The woman sat for a few moments in silence, watching him. "Didn't he have any when he came here?" she asked. "Not very much," said he. "Because," she went on, "if he didn't, he certainly managed it very cleverly. We all thought he had." Again there was a pause. Then suddenly Mrs. Winnie said, "Do you know, you feel differently about money from the way we do in New York. Do you realize it?" "I'm not sure," said he. "How do you mean?" "You look at it in an old-fashioned sort of way. A person has to earn it. It's a sign of something he's done. It came to me just now, all in a flash. We don't feel that way about money. We haven't any of us earned ours. We've just got it. And it never occurs to us to expect other people to earn it. All we want to know is if they have it." Montague did not tell his companion how very profound a remark he considered that. He was afraid it would not be delicate to agree with her. He had heard a story of a negro occupant of the mourner's bench, who was voluble in confession of his sins, but took exception to the fervor with which the congregation said, "Amen." "The Evanses used to be a lot funnier than they are now," continued Mrs. Winnie, after a while. "When they came here last year, they were really frightful. They had an English chap for a social secretary, a younger son of some broken-down old family. My brother knew a man who had been one of their intimates in the West, and he said it was perfectly excruciating. This fellow used to sit at the table and give orders to the whole crowd. 'Your ice cream fork should be at your right hand, Miss Mary.' 'One never asked for more soup, Master Robert.' And 'Miss Anna, Always move your soup spoon from you. That's better." "I fancy I shall feel sorry for them," said Montague. "Oh, you needn't," said the other promptly. "They'll get what they want." "Do you think so?" "Why, certainly they will. They've got the money, and they've been abroad. They're learning the game, and they'll keep at it until they succeed. What else is there for them to do? And then my husband says that old Evans is making himself a power here in the East, so that pretty soon they won't dare offend him." "Does that count?" asked the man. "Well, I guess it counts," laughed Mrs. Winnie. "It has of late." And she went on to tell him of the society leader who had dared to offend the daughters of a great magnate, and how the magnate had retaliated by turning the woman's husband out of his high office. That was often the way in the business world. The struggles were supposed to be affairs of men, but oftener than not the moving power was a woman's intrigue. You would see a great upheaval in Wall Street, and it would be that two of the big men quarreling over a mistress. You would see some man rush suddenly into high office, and that would be because his wife had sold herself to advance him. Mrs. Winnie took him uptown in her auto, and he dressed for dinner, and then came Oliver, and his brother asked, "Are you trying to put the Evanses into society?" "Who's been telling you about them?" asked the other. "Mrs. Winnie," said Montague. "What did she tell you?" Montague went over her recital, which his brother apparently found satisfactory. "It is not as serious as that," he said, answering the earlier question. "I help them a little now and then." "What do you do?" "Oh, advise them mostly. Tell them where to go and what to wear. When they first came to New York, they were dressed like parquets, you know, and—" here Oliver broke into a laugh. "I refrain from making jokes about them, and when I hear other people abusing them, I point out that they are sure to land in the end, and will be dangerous enemies. I've got one or two wedges started for them." "And do they pay you for doing it?" "You'd call it paying me, I suppose," replied the other. "The old man carries a few shares of stock for me now and then." "Carries a few shares?" echoed Montague, and Oliver explained the procedure. This was one of the customs which had grown up in a community where people did not have to earn their money. The recipient of the favor put up nothing and took no risks, but the other person was supposed to buy some stock for him, and then, when the stock went up, he would send a check for the profits. Many a man who would have resented a direct offer of money would assent pleasantly when a powerful friend offered to carry 100 shares for him. This was the way one offered a tip in the big world. It was useful in the case of newspaper men, whose good opinion of a stock was desired, or of politicians and legislators whose votes might help its fortune. When one expected to get into society, one must be prepared to strew such tips about him. "Of course," added Oliver, "what the family would really like me to do is to get the Robbie Wallings to take them up. I suppose I could get round 500,000 of them if I could manage that." To all of which Montague replied, "I see." A great light had dawned upon him. So that was the way it was managed. That was why one paid 30,000 a year for one's apartments, and 30,000 more for a girl's clothes. No wonder it was better to spend Christmas week at the Etheridge Devons than to labor at one's law books. "One more question," Montague went on. "Why are you introducing me to them?" "Well," his brother answered, "it won't hurt you. You'll find it amusing. You see, they've heard I had a brother, and they asked me to bring you. I couldn't keep you hidden forever, could I?" All this was while they were driving uptown. The Evanses' place was on Riverside Drive, and when Montague got out of the cab and saw it looming up in the semi-darkness, he emitted an exclamation of wonder. It was as big as a jail. "Oh, yes, they've got room," said Oliver, with a laugh. "I put this deal through for them. It's the old Lansom Palace, you know." They had the room, and likewise they had all the trappings of snobbery. Montague took the fact in at a glance. There were knee breeches and scarlet facings and gold braid, marble balconies and fireplaces and fountains, French masters and real Flemish tapestry. The staircase of their palace was a winding one, and there was a white velvet carpet which had been specially woven for it, and had to be changed frequently. At the top of it was a white cashmere rug which had a pedigree of 6 centuries, and so on. And then came the family. This tall, raw-boned, gigantic man, with weather-tanned face and straggly gray mustache. This was Jack Evans, and Mrs. Evans, short and pudgy, but with a kindly face, and not too many diamonds, and the Mrs. Evanses, stately and slender and perfectly arrayed. "Why, they're all right," was the thought that came to Montague. They were all right until they opened their mouths. When they spoke you discovered that Evans was a miner, and that his wife had been cook on a ranch; also that Anne and Mary had harsh voices, and that they never by any chance said or did anything natural. They were escorted into the stately dining room. Henry II, with a historic mantle taken from the Palace of Fontainebleau, and 4 great allegorical paintings of morning, evening, noon, and midnight upon the walls. There were no other guests. The table set for 6 seemed like a toy in the vast apartment. And in a sudden flash, with a start of almost terror, Montague realized what it must mean not to be in society, to have all this splendor and nobody to share it, to have Henry II dining rooms and Louis XVI parlors, and Louis XIV libraries, and to see them all empty, to have no one to drive with or talk with, no one to visit or play cards with, or to go to the theaters and the opera and have no one to speak to. Worse than that, to be stared at and smiled at, to live in this huge palace and know that all the horde of servants, underneath their cringing deferences, were sneering at you; to face that, to live in the presence of it day after day. And then, quite outside your home, the ever-widening circles of ridicule and contempt. Society, with all its hangers-on and parasites, its imitators and admirers. And someone had defied all that, and someone had taken up the sword and gone forth to beat down that opposition. Montague looked at this little family of 4, and wondered which of them was the driving force in this most desperate emprise. He arrived at it by a process of elimination. It could not be Evans himself. One saw that the old man was quite hopeless socially. Nothing could change his big hairy hands, or his lean scrawny neck, or his irresistible impulse to slide down in his chair and cross his long legs in front of him. The face and the talk of Jack Evans brought irresistibly to mind the mountain trail and the prospector's pack mule, the smoke of campfires and the odor of bacon and beans. 17 long years the man had tramped in deserts and mountain wilderness, and nature had graven her impress deep into his body and soul. He was very shy at this dinner, but Montague came to know him well in the course of time, and after he had come to realize that Montague was not one of the grafters, he opened up his heart. Evans had held on to his mine when he had found it, and he had downed the rivals who had tried to take it away from him, and he had bought the railroads who had tried to crush him, and now he had come to Wall Street to fight the men who had tried to ruin his railroads. But through it all he had kept the heart of a woman, and the sight of real distress was unbearable to him. He was the sort of man to keep a roll of $10,000 bills in his pistol pocket, and to give one away if he thought he could do it without offense. And on the other hand, men told how once, when he had seen a porter insult a woman passenger on his line, he had jumped up and pulled the bell cord, and had the man put out on the roadside at midnight, 30 miles from the nearest town. "No, it was the woman folks," he said to Montague, with his grim laugh. "It didn't trouble him at all to be called a nouveau riche, and when he felt like dancing a shakedown, he could take a run out to God's country. But the women folks had got the bees in their bonnet." The old man added sadly that one of the disadvantages of striking it rich was that it left the woman folks with nothing to do. Nor was it Mrs. Evans either. Sari, as she was called by the head of the house, sat next to Montague at dinner, and he discovered that with the very least encouragement the good lady was willing to become homelike and comfortable. Montague gave the occasion, because he was a stranger, and volunteered the opinion that New York was a shamelessly extravagant place, and hard to get along in, and Mrs. Evans took up the subject and revealed herself as a good-natured and kindly personage, who had wistful yearnings for mush and molasses and flapjacks and bread fried in bacon grease and similar sensible things, while her chef was compelling her to eat pâté de foie gras in aspic, and milk-fed guinea chicks, and biscuits glacés tortoni. Of course she did not say that at dinner. She made a game effort to play her part, with the result of at least one diverting experience for Montague. Mrs. Evans was telling him what a dreadful place she considered the city for young men, and how she feared to bring her boy here. "The men here have no morals at all," said she, and added earnestly, "I've come to the conclusion that Eastern men are naturally amphibious." Then as Montague knitted his brows and looked perplexed, she added, "Don't you think so?" And he replied, with as little delay as possible, that he had never really thought of it before. It was not until a couple of hours later that the light dawned upon him in the course of conversation with Miss Anne. "We met Lady Stonebridge at luncheon to-day," said the young person. "Do you know her?" "No," said Montague, who had never heard of her. "I think those aristocratic English women use the most abominable slang," continued Anne. "Have you noticed it?" "Yes, I have," he said. "And so utterly cynical. Do you know, Lady Stonebridge quite shocked Mother. She told her that she didn't believe in marriage at all, and that she thought all men were naturally polygamous." Later on, Montague came to know Mrs. Sari, and one afternoon, sitting in her petite Trianon drawing-room, he asked her abruptly, "Why in the world do you want to get into society?" And the poor lady caught her breath and tried to be indignant, and then, seeing that he was in earnest, and that she was cornered, broke down and confessed. "It isn't me," said she, "it's the gals." For along with the surrender went a revulsion to natural speech. "It's Mary, and more particularly Anne." They talked it over confidentially, which was a great relief to Mrs. Sari's soul, for she was cruelly lonely. So far as she was concerned, it was not because she wanted society, but because society didn't want her. She flashed up in sudden anger and clenched her fists, declaring that Jack Evans was as good a man as walked the streets of New York, and they would acknowledge it before he got through with them, too. After that she intended to settle down at home and be comfortable and mend her husband's socks. She went on to tell him what a hard road was the path of glory. There were hundreds of people ready to know them, but oh, such a riffraff! They might fill up their home with the hangers-on and the yellow, but no, they could wait. They had learned a lot since they had set out. One very aristocratic lady had invited them to dinner, and their hopes had been high, but alas, while they were sitting by the fireplace, someone admired a $30,000 emerald ring which Mrs. Evans had on her finger, and she had taken it off and passed it about among the company, and somewhere it had vanished completely. And another person had invited Mary to a bridge party, and though she had played hardly at all, her hostess had quietly informed her that she had lost $1,000. And the great Lady Stonebridge had actually sent for her and told her that she could introduce her into some of the very best circles, if only she was willing to lose always. Mrs. Evans had possessed a very homely Irish name before she was married, and Lady Stonebridge had got $5,000 from her to use some great influence she possessed in the Royal College of Heralds, and prove that she was descended directly from the noble old family of McGinnis, who had been lords of Ivanay, way back in the 14th century. And now Oliver had told them that this imposing charter would not help them in the least. In the process of elimination, there were the Misses Evans left. Montague's friends made many jests when they heard that he had met them, asking him if he meant to settle down. Major Venable went so far as to assure him that there was not the least doubt that either of the girls would take him in a second. Montague laughed and answered that Mary was not so bad. She had a sweet face and was good-natured, but also she was 2 years younger than Anne, and he could not get over the thought that 2 more years might make another Anne of her. For it was Anne who was the driving force of the family, Anne who had planned the great campaign, and had selected the Lamson Palace, and had pried the family loose from the primeval rocks of Nevada. She was cold as an iceberg, tireless, pitiless, to others as to herself. For 17 years her father had wandered and dug among the mountains, and for 17 years, if need be, she would dig beneath the walls of the fortress of society. After Montague had had his heart-to-heart talk with the mother, Miss Anne Evans became very haughty toward him, whereby he knew that the old lady had told about it, and that the daughter resented his presumption. But to Oliver she laid bare her soul, and Oliver would come and tell his brother about it, how she plotted and planned and studied, and brought new schemes to him every week. She had some of the real people brought over to secret sympathy with her. If there were some especial favor which she asked for, she would set to work with the good-natured old man, and the person would have some important money service done him. She had the people of society all marked. She was learning all their weaknesses, and the underground passages of their lives, and working patiently to find the key to her problem, some one family which was socially impregnable, but whose finances were in such a shape that they would receive the proposition to take up the Evanses, and definitely put them in. Montague used to look back upon all this with wonder and amusement, from those days, in the not far distant future, when the papers had cabled descriptions of the gowns of the Duchess of Arden, née Evans, who was the bright particular star of the London social scene. End of chapter 13.